The sun hung low above the flight line, a pale orange disk blurred by desert dust. Heat rose from the tarmac in shimmering waves, bending the silhouettes of machines that seemed too immense for a single human hand to tend. Among them stood the Apache, its body dark, angular, and alive with the promise of power. At its side, kneeling in the shadow of its armored belly, was Specialist Elena Marquez. Her hands worked quickly, but not without care, sliding each round into the ammo belts with a rhythm that sounded like muted thunder. Metal against metal. Click. Slide. Press. The cadence of her work had become a heartbeat of its own. The others nearby moved with similar precision, but Elena had always carried an added stillness, as though every task she touched deserved a measure of reverence. She was small compared to the aircraft she served, but there was no mistaking the strength in her frame. Sun-brown skin glistened with sweat. Her hair, tightly braided and tucked under her cap, left only her eyes to tell her story. They were steady, quiet, and, when caught by the light, surprisingly gentle. Beneath the sleeve of her uniform, just above her wrist, the faint edge of ink peeked out. Most never noticed. She kept it hidden, more by choice than by regulation. It wasn't meant to be seen casually. It was meant to be understood. The day had carried the weight of routine, yet something in the air pressed differently against her chest. Perhaps it was the silence before the aircraft roared to life, or the way the wind tugged at the flags overhead. Or perhaps it was because the pilot who approached, Captain Reeves, looked at her with eyes that paused, as though they caught something the rest of the world had overlooked. Elena kept her focus on the ammo belts, pressing each round into its place. The tattoo shifted slightly with the movement of her hand. Reeves knelt beside her, his gloves resting against his knees. For a moment, he didn't speak. He only watched the ink, as though it carried a story he already knew but couldn't bring himself to say aloud. The silence stretched. Elena felt it, not heavy, but curious, like the moment before a storm breaks. She had learned, over years of service, to keep her secrets tucked beneath fabric and discipline. Yet there was always the risk of being seen, truly seen, in the smallest of unguarded moments. Her chest tightened with the thought. She pressed another round into place, her fingers trembling just enough that the clink of metal sounded sharper than usual. Reeves's gaze lingered, not invasive, not judgmental, simply searching. The tattoo was not large. Just a single word, inked in delicate script, curling into the outline of wings. To Elena, it was more than memory. It was a tether, a piece of someone she had carried across oceans and through sleepless nights. She shifted slightly, as though to cover it, but Reeves spoke first, his voice low, steady. "I've seen that before," he said. Her hand stilled on the belt. She lifted her eyes to him, and in that single glance, something unspoken passed between them. Recognition. Not of her, but of the weight she bore. The desert wind caught at her sleeve, pulling it back just enough to reveal the word in its entirety. Reeves's eyes softened, and for the first time in months, maybe years, Elena felt the ground tilt beneath her certainty. She drew a quiet breath, steadying herself. The work remained before her. The ammo still needed loading. But in that brief exchange, a part of her that had long been silent stirred awake. It was fragile, uncertain, yet undeniable. The sun continued its descent, casting long shadows across the tarmac. Engines began to whir in the distance, the steady growl of rotors warming to life. Around them, the world moved on, but Elena felt the moment etch itself deep within her. For a heartbeat, she thought of the one whose name lived inked upon her skin, the voice she still carried in memory, the laughter that sometimes reached her in dreams. She thought of the promise she had made, to keep going, to hold her ground, to serve not only for herself, but for those who could no longer stand beside her. Her throat tightened, but she swallowed the ache, channeling it back into her work. The rounds slid into place, each one precise, each one necessary. She was steady again. Reeves stood slowly, his expression unreadable but touched with a quiet reverence. He said nothing more, and she did not ask. Some truths lived best in silence, carried not in words but in the recognition of those who understood without explanation. As the Apache's engines thundered alive, the air filled with dust and vibration. Elena rose, brushing grit from her hands. The tattoo remained hidden once more, the secret folded back beneath her sleeve. But she knew it had been seen, not in a way that left her exposed, but in a way that reminded her she was not alone. And for the first time in a long while, that knowledge felt like a kind of strength. The night settled heavy over the base, its quiet broken only by the distant churn of rotors and the faint metallic clatter of tools left behind. Floodlights carved pale cones across the tarmac, catching the dust that still lingered from the day. Elena moved slowly now, her body tired but her thoughts restless. She sat on the edge of her bunk, unlacing boots caked with grit. Around her, the barracks carried the muffled weight of sleep, the slow rise and fall of breath from soldiers too exhausted to dream. Elena had long since grown accustomed to the rhythm of nights like this, but tonight carried a subtle shift. The memory of Reeves's gaze, steady, searching, hovered at the edge of her mind. It wasn't the first time someone had noticed the ink, but rarely had anyone stopped long enough to acknowledge it, to see past the surface into the quiet story it held. She told herself it shouldn't matter. Yet it did. Her hand brushed against her sleeve, fingertips grazing the hidden mark. A flood of memory followed, unbidden. The scent of rain on Texas soil. A voice rising in laughter, deep and easy. The weight of a hand clasped firmly around hers as if to say, no matter what, we'll stand together. That hand, that voice belonged to Corporal Daniel Ruiz. His name was the one woven into the curve of wings, now etched on her skin. She closed her eyes. The world tilted back to the desert convoy, the explosion that tore the night apart, the silence that followed. She remembered searching through smoke, screaming his name until her throat bled raw. She remembered the stillness, the undeniable truth when she finally found him. It had been 3 years. Yet sometimes the ache rose so sharply she felt she was right back in that moment, kneeling in dust, heart-shattering. Elena pressed her palms against her knees, steadying herself. The barracks felt too close, the air too thick. She needed space, needed the sky. Pulling on a jacket, she stepped out into the night. The desert stretched wide, its horizon broken only by the hulking silhouettes of aircraft waiting like watchful sentinels. Stars scattered overhead, so sharp and clear they seemed almost within reach. The cool wind lifted strands of her hair from the braid, brushing them across her face like a touch that wasn't there. She walked toward the far edge of the runway, away from the hum of generators. Out here, the silence was deeper, punctuated only by her footsteps crunching on gravel. She stopped and tilted her head back, letting the stars fill her vision. For a moment, the weight eased. She let herself imagine Daniel seeing the same sky somewhere beyond reach. She whispered his name into the night, so softly it was nearly lost to the wind. You still carry him, don't you? The voice startled her. She turned to find Reeves a few yards away, hands shoved into the pockets of his flight jacket. His presence was quiet, respectful, an observer who had not come to intrude, but simply to stand nearby. Elena didn't answer immediately. She studied his face, the faint lines carved by years of command, the weariness behind his eyes that mirrored her own. Yes, she said finally. Her voice did not waver. Every day. Reeves nodded, as though he had expected no other answer. He stepped closer, though not too close, and stood beside her with his gaze lifted to the stars. Loss never leaves, he said quietly. We just learn how to carry it without breaking. The words struck her with a familiarity that went beyond comfort. It wasn't advice. It wasn't pity. It was recognition, as if he had walked that same terrain of grief and knew its landmarks. They stood in silence, two figures carved against the vast desert night. No more words were needed. Elena felt her breath slow, the ache in her chest easing with the steady rhythm of the quiet beside her. She realized then that she was not as alone as she had believed. Someone else had seen the tattoo, yes, but more importantly, someone else understood the story behind it without demanding it be spoken. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of oil and dust from the flight line. A flare rose in the distance, briefly painting the sky in red and gold before fading. Elena watched it disappear, her hand unconsciously brushing her sleeve again. She thought of Daniel, of the promise inked into her skin, of the strength it had taken to keep walking forward when all she had wanted was to collapse. She thought of Reeves's presence beside her, quiet but grounding. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, not out of obligation, but out of something resembling peace. When Reeves finally spoke again, his voice was almost lost to the wind. "We'll be wheels up at dawn." Elena nodded. She didn't need to ask what the mission was. She didn't need to dwell on fear or what might come. All that mattered was that when the time came, she would be there, steady hands, steady heart, carrying both the weight of her past and the quiet strength of the present. The night stretched on, vast and unending. But as Elena turned back toward the barracks, she felt its darkness differently. It was no longer just a reminder of what had been lost. It was also a canvas for what might still be found. The dawn arrived in muted shades of rose and amber, brushing the horizon with a fragile calm that felt at odds with the heaviness in the air. On the flight line, crews moved with quiet urgency, boots striking the concrete, voices low but firm. The Apache sat waiting, its dark frame glistening under the first touch of sunlight, every panel and blade sharp as if honed by purpose. Elena checked the crates of ammunition one last time, her hands steady even as the weight of anticipation pressed at her chest. Each belt of rounds slid into place with a mechanical click she had long since memorized, the sound a rhythm that grounded her. Around her, the scent of oil and dust clung thick, and the faint metallic tang of weaponry filled her lungs with every breath. Reeves approached, helmet tucked beneath his arm. His stride carried a controlled energy, measured, precise, the movement of a man who had learned long ago to wear composure like armor. He gave a short nod as their eyes met. No words passed between them, but the exchange was enough. The rotors began their slow turn, a heavy thump-thump that grew into a rolling thunder. The ground vibrated beneath Elena's boots, dust swirling into the morning light. She stepped back, watching as Reeves climbed into the cockpit. For a moment, his figure was outlined against the rising sun, shadow and flame together. The Apache roared alive, blades slicing the air, the sheer force of it pressing against her chest like a heartbeat too big for her body. She lifted a hand to shield her face from the wind, but her eyes never left the aircraft. She thought of Daniel, of how he had once described flight as freedom, as if the sky itself could lift sorrow from his shoulders. She wondered if Reeves felt the same. When the helicopter lifted, Elena's throat tightened. The weight of the earth gave way to the vastness of the sky, and for a fleeting second, she imagined herself inside, wires humming, adrenaline flooding, the world falling away beneath. Instead, she remained grounded, watching as the bird that carried her trust disappeared toward the horizon. The hours that followed were heavy with waiting. The base seemed quieter without the Apache's presence, as if every soldier felt the absence of its shadow. Elena busied herself with routine checks, but her mind drifted, replaying the memory of Reeves's words from the night before. Loss never leaves. We just learn how to carry it. She touched her sleeve unconsciously, tracing the hidden tattoo beneath. Daniel's wings. A promise carved into her skin, reminding her that she carried not only her grief, but also the fragments of his courage. The sun climbed higher, heat thickening in waves. Sweat beaded along her brow, stung her eyes, but she pressed on. When the distant thump of rotors finally returned, her head snapped upward. The Apache descended in a storm of dust, its silhouette cutting through the haze. Reeves emerged first, his steps uneven, his face streaked with grime and something harder, an echo of the sky's violence. Soldiers rushed forward, voices clipped, questions sharp, but Reeves waved them off with the weary authority of someone who had seen enough.
Elena caught his eye.
For an instant, the world around them blurred into silence. She read something in his expression, not defeat, not exactly, but a recognition of how narrow the line was between return and ruin. Later, when the base had settled and the Apache stood cooling in the shade of its hangar, Reeves found her by the crates. His hands were still trembling faintly, though he tried to hide it by curling them into fists. "Today was close," he said simply. Elena met his gaze, unflinching. "But you made it back." A pause lingered. Reeves exhaled, as if searching for the right shape of truth. There was a moment up there. "I thought about how easy it would be to let go, just for the silence. Then I remembered your words from last night, that you still carry him." Elena's chest tightened. She hadn't expected her honesty to echo back to her like this, carried into the heart of battle. Reeves continued, his voice quieter. "It reminded me that maybe carrying isn't weakness. Maybe it's the only thing that keeps us from falling apart." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of memory, of pain, of fragile understanding. Elena looked at him, the lines of exhaustion on his face, the flicker of raw humanity in his eyes. She thought of her own nights staring at the stars, of Daniel's laughter, of how grief had carved her into someone she no longer recognized but still fought to honor. "Yes," she said softly, "carrying is what keeps us human." The words settled between them, firm as the ground beneath their boots. Reeves nodded, and for the first time, there was no barrier in his expression, only gratitude. As evening draped itself over the desert, Elena walked back toward her quarters. The air had cooled, the first stars piercing the deepening sky. She paused at the edge of the runway, watching the horizon fade into darkness. Her heart still ached. It always would. But tonight, it felt less like a wound and more like a scar, tender, but proof of survival. And as she stood there, the sound of the wind against her jacket, she realized something new, that grief could be both a burden and a compass. It was heavy, yes, but it pointed her toward connection, toward resilience, toward the quiet strength she hadn't known she still carried. Night draped itself over the base like a heavy cloak, the desert wind carrying with it a silence that felt more watchful than restful. Elena sat on the edge of her bunk, boots still laced, the canvas walls of her quarters fluttering with each gust. The faint hum of generators pulsed in the background, steady as a heartbeat, a reminder that even in stillness, the machinery of war never truly slept. Her hands rested on her knees, fingers curled as if holding something invisible. She had not spoken much since the Apache's return earlier that day, yet her thoughts roared louder than the helicopter's blades. Reeves's words, "Carrying is what keeps us human," looped in her mind, steady and insistent, like a refrain she couldn't release. She reached for the small tin box at her bedside. Inside, folded with almost reverent care, lay letters from Daniel. The edges were softened from years of unfolding, reading, folding again. She traced the creases, her thumb lingering over the faded ink of his handwriting. Each line was alive with his voice, his jokes, his stubborn optimism. Outside, a burst of laughter broke the stillness, young soldiers trading stories, clinging to levity as though it could ward off the darkness. Elena closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. For a moment, she imagined Daniel among them, his smile catching firelight, his presence filling space the way it always had. The ache was sharp, but softer than before, like a wound scabbing over. The next morning came in a blaze of copper and gold. The desert air was cool at dawn, the kind of fleeting freshness that gave way to heat too quickly. Elena walked toward the hangar, boots crunching against gravel, her breath fogging faintly before the sun's warmth dissolved it. The Apache loomed ahead, its frame silhouetted against the sky, a reminder of both destruction and survival. Reeves was already there, leaning against the aircraft with his helmet beside him. He looked up as she approached, offering a faint nod. His eyes carried the same exhaustion as hers, an echo, a mirror. "You sleep?" he asked. "Enough," she replied, though the truth was less certain. They stood together in the cool hush of morning, the helicopter between them like a silent witness. For a while, neither spoke, but the quiet was not uncomfortable. It was weighted with recognition, as though words would only scrape against something too raw to touch. When Reeves finally spoke, his voice was low, deliberate. "I saw the tattoo again yesterday. The wings. They stayed with me up there." Elena's hand instinctively brushed her sleeve, the fabric concealing what was etched into her skin. "They remind me of him," she said softly. "But sometimes I think they remind me of myself, too. Of who I had to become after." Reeves studied her, his expression unreadable. "Maybe that's why it shook me so much. Not just what it meant about him, but what it said about you." Elena felt her breath catch, though she masked it quickly. His words weren't flattery, nor pity. They were observation, almost reverence. And in that moment, she realized the tattoo wasn't just a private keepsake. It had become part of the language through which others saw her resilience. The day pressed on with drills, briefings, the endless rhythm of military life. Yet beneath the surface, something had shifted. Elena carried her tasks with the same precision as always, but a quiet resolve pulsed within her, steadier than before. That evening, she found herself drawn back to the flight line. The sky had deepened into indigo, stars pricking through its canvas one by one. The Apache rested in the glow of floodlights, its blades still, casting long shadows across the tarmac. Reeves was there again, seated on a crate, his gaze fixed upward at the stars. He didn't turn when she approached, but his voice carried across the still air. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, "if the sky remembers them? The ones who didn't come back?" Elena paused, the question pulling at the quiet corners of her heart. She lowered herself onto the crate beside him, her shoulder brushing his. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I like to think the sky carries echoes. Maybe that's why it feels heavier some nights." They sat together in silence, the night vast around them. A soft breeze stirred, carrying with it the faint scent of sand and oil. Elena lifted her eyes to the stars, their cold brilliance stretching far beyond her reach. For the first time in a long while, the ache in her chest did not hollow her. Instead, it filled her with a fragile sense of connection between past and present, earth and sky, herself and the man sitting quietly beside her. Reeves spoke again, his tone softer this time. "When I froze yesterday, it wasn't fear. It was remembering that there's more to this than missions and survival. That every round we fire, every flight we make, it all comes from what we carry." Elena turned to him, his face half-lit by the glow of the floodlights. She saw the truth in his words, not as confession but as understanding. Slowly, she nodded. "Yes," she said. "And carrying means we keep them alive. In us. Through us." The quiet that followed was not the silence of absence, but of presence. The kind that spoke of bonds formed not in words, but in recognition. When Elena finally rose to leave, the stars had multiplied across the sky, their brilliance sharp against the black. She lingered for a moment, her gaze steady, her heart quieter than it had been in years. Tonight, she realized, the sky did not feel heavy. It felt vast, and in its vastness, there was room for memory, for healing, and for hope. The morning broke with a restless sky. Clouds streaked thin across the horizon, as though the wind itself carried unease. On the base, the atmosphere was taut, soldiers moving with clipped urgency. A mission had been called, urgent, precise, and heavy with the unspoken knowledge that not all would return the same as they left. Elena tightened the straps of her vest, her hands steady though her chest carried the familiar press of weight. She moved along the crates, checking ammunition, loading belts into place with the same precision she had learned to trust. Each metallic click echoed like a heartbeat. Her palms were lined with dust and oil, but beneath the grime, the memory of Daniel's wings etched into her skin pulsed like a quiet oath. Reeves approached with his helmet under one arm, his flight suit streaked with yesterday's dust. His eyes found hers in the crowd of motion, and though his expression remained composed, there was something in the set of his jaw, a gravity she recognized. "You're flying heavy today," she said, her voice even. He nodded once. "It's a rough zone. We'll be gone longer than usual." She studied him for a moment, the light of the rising sun cutting across his face, softening the sharpness of war with a fleeting warmth. "Just bring her back," she murmured, her hand brushing the Apache's frame as if blessing it. Reeves's gaze lingered a moment longer than necessary before he climbed into the cockpit. The rotors began their slow churn, air whipping into a storm. Dust rose in clouds, stinging Elena's eyes, but she didn't blink. She watched until the aircraft lifted from the earth, a great shadow pulling free of gravity's hold, its roar carrying across the desert. The hours stretched thin. The base hummed with routine, but beneath it lay a silence, too sharp to ignore. Elena busied herself with repairs, with small tasks that demanded focus, but each distant thump of sound set her heart racing. She imagined Reeves out there, the sky alive with fire, the world collapsing into fragments of dust and steel. When the first reports filtered in, murmurs rippled across the base. Heavy resistance. Contact in unexpected numbers. The words carried weight, pressing into her chest like cold stone. Still, she kept her composure, her hands moving with deliberate calm as she tightened bolts and checked gauges, though inside, the storm was rising. It was dusk when the Apache finally returned. The horizon burned in shades of orange and crimson, as though the sky itself mirrored the violence it had witnessed. The aircraft descended hard, skidding slightly as it landed, smoke rising from its flank. Soldiers rushed forward, voices urgent, the air crackling with the scent of scorched metal. Reeves climbed out, his steps uneven, his helmet clutched in one trembling hand. His face was streaked with grime, eyes bloodshot, yet alive. Elena was at his side before she could think, her hand steadying him as his knees threatened to give. "What happened?" she asked, her voice low but firm. He drew in a ragged breath, shaking his head as if to clear it. "We almost didn't make it back. Took fire from all sides. His words faltered, breaking on the weight of what could not be spoken. Elena tightened her grip on his arm. "But you did," she said, her voice a thread of steel wrapped in softness. "You made it back." His eyes met hers then, and in them she saw the truth of what survival cost. The trembling, the exhaustion, the unspoken grief for those who might not return on another day. He exhaled slowly, the sound raw, as though releasing a piece of the burden. Later, when the chaos settled and the Apache stood battered but whole in the dim glow of floodlights, Reeves found her again. He leaned against the crates, his shoulders heavy, his gaze lowered. "I froze again," he admitted, his voice rough. "For a moment I thought about letting go. Just ending the noise. But then I remembered your words. That carrying is what keeps us human. I held on to that. Onto you." Elena's throat tightened, her chest rising with a sharp breath. She stepped closer, her hand brushing his sleeve, grounding him. "You don't have to carry it alone," she said quietly. "Not anymore." The night deepened around them, the stars scattered across the sky like fragments of memory. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of sand and smoke. Reeves looked at her, something unspoken passing between them, trust, fragile but real, forged not by words, but by the silence they shared. Elena lifted her eyes to the horizon, where the last embers of daylight bled into darkness. For the first time in years, the ache in her chest was not just loss. It was connection, resilience, and the fragile hope that healing could live alongside grief. She closed her eyes, letting the night wash over her. The world was still heavy, but her heart was not alone in carrying it. The desert night was quieter than usual, the kind of stillness that felt intentional, as if the world itself was pausing to breathe. Elena walked slowly along the edge of the runway, her boots brushing against gravel, the cool air brushing against her cheeks. Above her, the stars stretched in unbroken brilliance, vast and unyielding, a silent canopy under which countless stories had been lived, lost and remembered. In her pocket, she carried the folded letter she had taken from Daniel's box the night before. She had read it so many times she no longer needed the paper, but tonight, the feel of it against her palm was a comfort. His words were as present as the wind, the echo of a voice carried through time. Reeves found her there, his steps measured, the faint scrape of boots against stone breaking the silence. He stopped a few paces away, as if unsure whether to close the distance. His presence was steady, like the hum of the generators that ran without pause, grounding the fragile quiet of night. "You haven't been sleeping," he said softly. Elena didn't look at him right away. Instead, she tilted her head back, eyes fixed on the endless dark above. Some nights are harder than others. He moved closer, standing beside her. Together they looked at the stars, their breaths mingling in the cool night air. Reeves's hands were loose at his sides, but there was a tension in his shoulders, the kind that came not from fear but from the weight of unspoken thoughts. "Elena," he began, his voice low, "you said once that grief is both a burden and a compass. I think I finally understand. Today, when the fire came too close, I didn't think about dying. I thought about living and why it mattered. I thought about what we carry and how it shapes where we go." His words settled into her like pebbles dropped into still water, rippling outward. She turned toward him, her gaze searching his. There was no bravado in his expression, no mask of command, just the rawness of a man who had faced the sky's sharpest edges and returned with truth. Her throat tightened. She unfolded the letter slowly, her fingers trembling as she held it out to him. "These are Daniel's words. I think you should hear them." Reeves accepted the paper gently, as though it were fragile enough to shatter. He read in silence, his eyes moving steadily across the faded lines. When he finished, he let out a long breath, the kind that seemed to release more than air. "He wrote about carrying light," Reeves said softly, "even in the darkest places." Elena nodded, her eyes glistening but steady. "He believed it was our duty, to each other, to ourselves. Some days, I feel like I've failed him. Other days, I think, maybe just surviving is enough." Reeves folded the letter carefully, returning it to her hands. "You haven't failed him. You've carried him farther than anyone could have asked." And maybe, he hesitated, then continued, "maybe now it's time to let the weight change. Not to lose it, but to let it guide you towards something more than pain." The night wind stirred, lifting strands of her hair, carrying with it the faint scent of sand and oil. Elena closed her eyes, letting his words sink in. For so long, she had clung to grief as though releasing it meant betrayal. But standing there, under the weight of the stars, she realized letting grief change shape was not abandonment. It was survival. It was love carried forward. She drew a deep breath, opening her eyes. "Then let's carry it together." Reeves's answer was not in words, but in the way he stood closer, his presence wrapping around her like quiet assurance. Side by side, they faced the horizon, where the faintest glow of dawn threatened the edge of the sky. The first light broke slowly, brushing the desert in hues of pale gold. The Apache stood nearby, silhouetted against the rising day, its frame battered but whole, a mirror of themselves. Elena stepped forward, her hand resting against its cool surface. "This was Daniel's world," she said quietly. "And now it's ours to honor. Not by drowning in what's gone, but by living in what remains." Reeves placed his hand beside hers, the metal beneath their palms cold but steady. For a long moment, they stood like that, touching the vessel that had carried their fear, their survival, their unspoken hope. As the sun climbed higher, Elena felt something shift within her. The ache would never vanish, she didn't want it to, but it no longer felt like chains. It was wings, lifting her towards something she had almost forgotten. The possibility of peace. She turned toward Reeves, her eyes catching the light of morning. "Today," she whispered, "I feel him with me. Not as a shadow, as a guide." Reeves met her gaze, his own steady, the corners of his mouth softening into something that almost resembled a smile. "Then maybe that's what carrying really means." The day stretched ahead, uncertain and fragile, but no longer unbearable. Together, they walked back toward the base, the hum of life rising around them, the desert unfolding in quiet resilience. For the first time in years, Elena's heart beat not only with loss, but with hope, woven into the same rhythm, carried forward into the dawn.